Hey kids, it's Chef Jack here with another batch of independent comics reviews in the hopes of giving you, and us, let's be honest, a break from the absolute disaster that's been Marvel Comics lately. The indie comic scene right now is thriving and vibrant, and if you haven't taken a look at some of these titles, maybe we can convince you to do so. So without further ado, let's get started. This time around, we're going to be taking a look at American Gods number 6, Betty Page number 2, Blood Brothers, Hermanos de Sang, number 2, Briggs Land Lone Wolves, number 2, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Season 11, number 9, Generation Gone, number 2, George R.R. Martin's A Clash of Kings, number 3, Heartthrob, Season 2, number 2, Incidentals, number 1, Jim Henson's The Power of the Dark Crystal, number 5, Kill the Minotaur, number 2, Mage, Book 3, number 1, Normandy Gold, number 2, Rom vs. Transformers number 2, and Skin and Earth number 2. None of the books I reviewed this time were bad enough to earn 1 star. The 2-star books. These comics might be bad, but there's usually 1 or 2 things that save them from being truly horrible. Heartthrob Season 2, number 2. The first issue of this series was a pretty good story. This one is just kind of confusing. The problem is, I'm not really sure who to root for here. I think that Chris Sabella is trying to tell some sort of Bonnie and Clyde meets Ghost romance about a thief and her dead boyfriend who are still in love with each other. The problem is, when you get down to brass tacks, the story of Bonnie and Clyde isn't romantic. And the romance in Ghost was actually a bit creepy and sad. What you end up with is a female character who's supposedly strong and independent, but who comes across as being pushy and demanding and unlikable and utterly dependent upon approval from the ghost of her dead boyfriend. This character is turning into a stereotype right before our eyes, and it's dragging the comic book down with it. Rom vs. the Transformers, number 2. There is absolutely nothing wrong with using a comic book to send a message. There have been wonderful message books in the past that were necessary reading, that should be taught in schools because they were so wonderfully done and the message involved in them was so important. That said, just like the first issue, Rom vs. the Transformers number 2 is one of those books that hits you over the head with a sledgehammer just to drive the point home. And in this case, the point is that prejudice and discrimination is bad. When you have that message crammed down your throat every 2 pages, you get tired of having it crammed down your throat. I will say one thing, though. Every character in the story displays some form of prejudicial behavior, and none of it seems to come out of nowhere. It's not just because. And I do acknowledge that the writers are trying to make this story fun and action-packed, but like I said, the fact that they can't go a single page without once again reminding us that discrimination is wrong, folks, it gets in the way of the story. The 3-star books. These comics are just average. They fall neither on the good end of the spectrum nor the bad. Betty Page number 2. While this issue is an improvement on the absolutely lackluster first issue, I can't honestly say that it's a big improvement. I mean, it's not that the story was awful or that the art was horrible. It's just that it was boring. I think the problem might lie behind the scenes because for some reason, this comic book felt like the creators were holding back. As a result, the storyline just came off as just too easy, too convenient sometimes. On top of that, Worley and Cermak can't seem to decide whether they're going to try for a realistic art style or a comic book art style, if you know what I mean. You know, whether they want to go realistic or cartoony, I guess is a better way to put it. I will say this, there's a lot of potential here that is not being used. This could be an amazing book. I feel like it could be an amazing book, but they have to put more effort into it. But they aren't, so it isn't. George R.R. Martin's A Clash of Kings number 3. This issue is almost minimalist in nature. It tells the story, and if you've read the books or seen Season 2 of A Game of Thrones on HBO, you're already familiar with this story. By dividing the action between Jon Snow and Tyrion Lannister, which is a smart way to do it, but it also limits the storytelling in various ways. Unfortunately, it also means that there's a lot going on, so much so that the plot of the issue becomes muddled. What I mean is, it's good that the writers are trying to be so faithful to the books, and they are trying to be faithful to the books as opposed to being faithful to the television series. But the books had hundreds of pages to deliver this information and to explore this story. The comic only has a couple dozen, and it shows. Incidentals number 1. This is the first team book in Landforge's Catalyst Prime universe. The world itself shows a lot of promise, and is naturally diverse without feeling forced. It does feel fresh and exciting, the world that is. That said, there seems to be nothing going on in this particular issue that we haven't seen already done, and in some cases done better, in the same sort of books by the big two companies. The storyline, in a nutshell, is a bunch of newly superpowered people are brought together by a rich mentor who trains them to be a team. We've seen this same formula dozens of times, and that's the problem. This is not a bad issue, per se, but it's hardly original, and the art is not dynamic enough to differentiate it from something you might have read back in the 1990s. It has the potential, but that potential is not being tapped. Jim Henson's The Power of the Dark Crystal, number 5. Whenever you have a limited series that runs for more than about half a dozen issues, inevitably there's going to be at least one that is going to be an underperformer. And for The Power of the Dark Crystal, that is this issue. This is filler. That's all. It's filler. Not a lot happens. It has a few interesting moments, and it's got a small amount of solid character development, but for the most part, the narrative of this book is not the strongest. The action is weak, the plot is simplistic and it's thin. That said, the visual side is just majestic. The artwork is amazing. Kelly and Nicole Matthews' visuals make it really easy to immerse yourself into this background world, and the look of it just feels true to Jim Henson's original designs from the movie. So I'm going to put this on the It's Up to You list. If you really want to read it, go right ahead. But it doesn't really do anything to move the plot together, so it's not like it's necessary. Kill the Minotaur number 2. This issue is basically a locked room mystery in which we know the eventual outcome. I mean, come on. This story was written sometime around 500 BCE, so the fact that the Minotaur is going to die by the end of it is hardly a spoiler. The trick here is to make us interested in the journey, the way that the hero gets to fighting the Minotaur and beating it. There are some very intriguing elements about this issue, mainly the idea that our hero isn't always that heroic. In addition, the horror of the situation is played up far more than in the original tale, which is mostly about how a strong, heroic man goes and defeats a monster. In the end, though, I found that this comic was propped up way too much by its artwork than by the writing. It's not a bad book per se. What it is, though, is a mediocre story with amazing artwork. Skin and Earth number 2. In comparison to the first issue, I feel almost like this second issue has run out of momentum already, and it's a bit disappointing. This issue doesn't contain all the world-building elements that Skin and Earth number 1 had, and thus it feels kind of empty comparatively. Instead of that, it focuses on N's so-called relationship with Priest, or lack thereof. This book is dialogue heavy, and it's melodramatic, and while everything is well written and given the premise of this particular issue, it's a bit odd given the overall premise of the series. It's not what I expected. The storytelling is internally cohesive, though. I want to make that clear. And in general, the art is very clean, but there's nothing here to build expectations on. I mean, there was a lot of potential in that first issue, but here there's no indication if that potential will ever be met. And like I said, that's just disappointing. The 4-star books. Now we're getting to the good stuff. These are the comics we can actually recommend. Blood Brothers number 2. In this issue, the brothers are working their way through the supernatural food chain, searching for the stolen Aztec skull. And guys, if you just heard me say that last sentence and your interest isn't piqued, I have to wonder why the hell you're reading comic books at all. This issue is light and it's fun, while simultaneously moving the plot along. It's utterly dynamic, and even the scenes that were heavy with dialogue flow pretty steadily. My single complaint is the cartoony art drags it down from perfection. As fun as the story is, as breezy as the story is, the art just does not fit the action at all. Otherwise, well, what can you say about a comic book that teams up a police detective and a luchador superhero to fight demons and werewolves? This is just a great book. Briggs Land Lone Wolves #2. This issue is all about the characters trying to prevent a bad situation from getting worse, and of course, in stories like this, that is precisely when things get worse. There was a lot of very subtle character development going on, especially of Isaac Briggs and how he's dealing with coming back from the war in Afghanistan. The conflict in this issue is all about the traitorous conservative fantasies about guns and government authority and the false idea that when push comes to shove, their pathetic little militia movements are actually going to be able to stand up to the United States Army and turn us into a white power wonderland. There's absolutely nothing like this comic book on the shelves right now. It is not a perfect story, and it is a bit on the disturbing side, but overall, I have got to recommend it. Normandy Gold #2. Back when I reviewed Normandy Gold #1, I mentioned in kind of an offhand way that there was, that there was going to be some violence, there was going to be some nudity, there was going to be some adult situation involved in this title. So if that's not the kind of stuff you're into, you really should stop reading. Well, the second issue has ramped all of that up considerably, and it's added drug use to the list. So again, if that offends you, give this a pass. Now, if you don't mind that kind of stuff, let me tell you that this is an amazingly well-written, gritty drama that harkens back to the 1970s exploitation films. It has vicious criminals and driven cops who are doing anything to stop them, including ignoring the rules. It's page after page filled with jaw-dropping action that keeps you right on the edge of your seat. It's fast-paced, the dialogue is perfect, the art fits like a glove, and like I said, there's sex and violence, enough to make it really entertaining. The 5-star books. These books are the best of the best, at least for this week. These are the ones that we recommend the most. American Gods #6. The mark of a really fantastic adaptation of a book or a movie or a TV show into comic book form is if the reader of the comic book already knows what's going to happen because they're familiar with the movie or they're familiar with the book or they're familiar with the TV show, and yet they can't wait to see what happens in the next issue of the comic book. That is what happened with this issue here. I got to tell you, there's a lot going on in issue #6 of American Gods. There's reality-bending encounters with ancient deities, mundane but terrifying encounters with mysterious government agents who openly laugh at the idea that they are accountable to anybody. We, the readers, are just along for the ride for all of this. It's a compelling issue, and one of the things I really like about it is how well it juxtaposes some very dark themes with absolutely hilarious comical moments. If there's anything to complain about, it's that this is the sort of story where if you don't start from the beginning, you're going to be lost. But overall, this was a very exciting read. Buffy the Vampire Slayer Season 11, Number 9. This issue might be the best we've seen since Dark Horse started publishing the new seasons back in 2007, and that's saying something since, 10 years. What we got here is a book that is full of action, with exciting twists and turns that feel like a classic episode of the show. Even though the action is center stage, the dialogue that made, the Buffy program so special is present and in buckets worth. The art flows smoothly and it keeps up with the story tempo in addition to simply being appealing to the eye. And lastly, this issue sets up the upcoming season climax beautifully. It's hard not to get excited for future issues. Generation Gone #2. Folks, this is 2 5-star issues in a row. On the one hand, with this book, you've got these three teenagers who've been given superpowers by an unknown source. On the other side, you've got a scientist who's basically playing God with other people's lives. The reason why this issue is so strong is because not only do we get straight to the kids using their new powers and figuring things out, we also get a glimpse at the reason why these kids have powers in the first place. I'm not going to go into the social commentary aspects that drive the plot, but I will say that this series is so strong in its character development that after only 2 issues, every single major character, good guys, bad guys, in between, it doesn't matter. They're all rounded, complete individuals and not ciphers. And there is literally no way to predict where this story is going to go next. It is amazingly exciting. Mage, Book 3, Number 1. I'll be honest, going in, I am trying very hard not to have too many expectations about this series, but given that I loved Mage Book 1 and Mage Book 2, that's going to be difficult for me. This first issue is more of a reintroduction to Kevin Matchstick, who's the reborn King Arthur. There's a lot to like in this issue, a lot to like. The dialogue is fantastic, the action is fun. It's enjoyable to see Kevin get back to it once again. Even if it's all essentially against, basic mooks that have no chance against him, and not the big, larger scope villain. Speaking of the larger scope villain, there's not a lot of detail regarding her, but that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I'm sure we're going to be learning about her in future issues. This particular issue is a great start, and I cannot wait for more. But folks, what did you think about these comics? Was I right? Was I wrong? Was I, just completely full of it? Tell me why you think so in the comments below. If you like this video and you want to see more of them, click like and subscribe and the little notification bell in the corner so you don't miss any of our future videos. And if you feel like helping out, we've got a Patreon page and a VidMe page set up, and there are links below. Feel free to wander over and drop $1 in the till. But even if you don't do that, thanks for taking the time out to watch. We do appreciate it, and we hope to catch you next time. Thank you very, very much for watching.